Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning for the Title IIA Private Schools webinar. Before we get going, just a couple of reminders. If you haven't already, will you please make sure that you have muted yourself, because we sometimes get feedback when folks accidentally have their speakers either through their phone or their computer on. So if you could double check that before we get started, I'd appreciate it. And then if someone would be willing to just type into the chat that they can actually hear me, then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, great. We've got a couple of people. All right, well, I know that you are all very busy people, and we want to make sure that we take care of this in a timely fashion. I do not think this webinar will take an hour. So unless you have many, many questions, we should be able to wrap this up in a half an hour or so. For your colleagues that were not able to join us today, we are recording this webinar, and we will post the PowerPoint on the website pretty shortly after this session today. The webinar, in case you're unaware, any webinars that we post on the ODE website have to be closed captioned, which is increasing the time that it takes for us to get them up and posted on the website, but we will do that as soon as we can. My name is Sarah Martin. I am an education specialist at the Oregon Department of Education, and I support Title IIA. And with me today is my colleague, Russ Sweet.
Hello.
He is serving as our Interim Ombudsman for private schools. You probably know him better as in his previous life in Title IIA, excuse me. But he's here to work with us as we talk about private schools today. So the outcomes for our webinar today are really twofold. We know that consultation is going to begin shortly in the spring. We encourage that to take place earlier in the spring than may have happened in the past. And so we wanted to kind of review some of those requirements for participation. And we also wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of guidance for 18-19 as it relates to private schools. This is really designed to be kind of that just-in-time professional development, as it were, as we move into that consultation season. So that's what we're going to start with. Russ is going to talk to us a little bit about consultation requirements.
Hello and welcome. It is important that consultation begin really soon, and we are looking at beginning this month and moving into March. The goal of consultation really is an agreement between the LEA or the school district and appropriate private school officials on what the programs are going to be and how things are going to be completed and done for eligible students and staff in those private schools. And it's really important that this be an ongoing dialogue and that it's really a collaboration as you consult. Some requirements around consultation is that it does happen every year. One of the questions that I get frequently is, well, I've tried to consult with this school in the past. Do I have to do this and continue to do this? And the answer to that is yes. You do have to make a yearly or an annual reaching out to these schools. Several things can happen. One can be that they have an administrative change and suddenly there's a desire to be a part of this. But it really does demonstrate, though, the effort on the district's part to do this. We do recommend late February, early March, because sometimes contracts and things of that nature can take some time to get off the ground. And the goal is really to begin the program the following year when school begins. You should ensure that all the topics are covered that are required in the statute. One of the best ways to ensure that is to use the form from Transact called Verification of Annual Private School Consultation. It's a Transact form. It covers a lot of items. The particular number of that form is PS02. And if you have any questions about that, you can look at our website for private schools, ESEA private school participation, and on there you will see some documents about Transact forms. If you've never used Transact before, it is a wonderful tool that is provided free of charge to every school district in Oregon that has not only forms for private school consultation, but others as well. But you do want to look at that list of items. Under ESSA, the items increased from the previous version of the law to the topics that have to be discussed. Okay. As Sarah mentioned, I am the Interim Ombudsman. Every state is required to have an ombudsman for private schools under the ESSA statute. The role of the ombudsman is really to ensure that both parties are participating in the process and that private schools are getting their equitable share of services under the federal statute. Toward that end, the ombudsman is available to attend consultations, and so if that is something that you particularly would like to have happen, by all means, contact myself or the support staff, Stacy Ankrum, and we'll be happy to try to set that up for you. Let me just update you on the role of the ombudsman. As many of you know, I retired in July, and I've come back to serve in that capacity until we have a more or less permanent replacement. And that position is currently open and will close on the 19th of February for a part-time ombudsman that we'll have in place. I am not applying for that, so it will be somebody other than me, but we hope to have that person on board sometime in March and ready to really go all out on the program by the end of April. Okay, so the second thing there is to ensure compliance with the ESSA, and that's, I mentioned that already, that is really the ombudsman's role. We are also, this person is also the hearings officer for any complaints that come to the Department of Education from either private school or the school district regarding private school equitable services. This is one stop on the way to an appeal. If whatever decisions are reached here are not necessarily final, those decisions can be appealed to the U.S. Department of Education. But this, currently I function as the hearings officer for any complaints that come to the Department of Education. And then finally is to collect documentation of consultation. What we are doing currently is we are requiring that school districts, we are going to be requiring the school districts submit that form from Transact that is a verification that consultation has occurred, that PS02 form from Transact, or something similar to that verifies that consultation has occurred. Currently, our plan is to have districts upload that into IndiStar so that we could check it there. So anyway, those are basically the functions of the ombudsman role, and now I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thanks, Rob. You have a question, huh?
Okay.
Okay.
And forgive me, my Roman numeral translation is a little off. How do we determine what fair share is for private schools versus Title IIA? Will we be getting guidance on that soon? Okay,
there should be guidance coming out. As you know, Title IIA has been kind of a sticky wicket this entire year. What we have indicated for calculating that equitable share is using the same types of formulas that you use to calculate your Title IIA equitable share. So it's based really on student enrollment counts, just like 2A. You look at counting the after you've taken your administrative or indirect, I believe, and Sarah's going to go into this a little bit with 2A, and it'll kind of clear it up for 4A as well. But after you look at what's left, you basically combine the enrollment from your participating private schools and your public schools, and then you divide that number into your allocation to determine a per child amount, and that's how you will calculate your 4A private school participation amount.
Thank you, Russ. And we have that built into the Title IIA application, but we do actually have a spreadsheet that we used to use for that purpose, so it sounds like perhaps that could be a useful tool to share.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so just a couple of reminders that, as we mentioned, as we're getting into consultation season, these are kind of the big things to keep in mind. The first being that the change that we had this year in the calculation of the equitable service amounts, namely that they are based on the LEA's total allocation. So you'll recall in previous years there were multiple categories that would allow the district to deduct costs, and that the equitable share was based on the district's total allocation for professional learning in their district. That was how they calculated it for private schools. That has changed. So now that means things like coursework for teachers, testing costs for teachers, those things cannot be deducted from the district's overall allocation before the calculation for private schools is made. You can deduct administrative costs. That is still allowable, but it can't exceed the district's indirect rate. So you cannot deduct the entire salary of your administrator for 2A, for example, if that amount would exceed the indirect rate that's negotiated by the district. And as Russ mentioned, it is based on total enrollment. So you are taking all of the numbers of students enrolled in the district and all of the numbers of students enrolled in the private school to do the calculation for the per pupil. As I mentioned, we have a tab in the Title IIA online application that does those calculations for you. But I just want to clarify that because we do sometimes get questions. It's different than Title IIA calculation, so it is all students. The second reminder is around obligation of funds, and this is really about carryover. So with the reauthorization and the implementation of ESSA, it is now the case that non-public students, so private schools, must obligate their funds within the year that they received them. So funds are awarded, allocated on July 1, and they have to spend them. Private schools have to engage in their activities by September 30th of the following year. So beginning with the 17-18 allocation that they received this year, private schools cannot carry those funds over into 18-19. That is an important piece of information that, if it has not already been shared with the private schools, should be shared at the consultation or even sooner. If they have remaining funds from their 16-17 allocation, they are still eligible for carryover of those funds. But any funds moving forward, anything from the 17 allocation on, is not eligible for carryover for private schools. So it is important that your schools know that.
Sarah, we have a question, I think, on reminder 1.
Oh, sure. Okay, I'm going to try to go back. Hey, look at that.
All students in private schools or just students from home districts?
So you are, on the spreadsheet, it prompts you to include the total enrollment for the district. So that is how many students are enrolled in your district. And it asks you also to include the number of students enrolled in the private school. So there are 2 separate fields, and the spreadsheet actually combines those to do the calculation, but you are putting in all students in your district in one field and all students in the private school in the other field. Perhaps your question has to do with, is it only the students at the private school who reside within your district? I think maybe that's the question. No, the answer is no. That is not how it is calculated. It is all students in that private school regardless of where they reside, because the private school is within the boundaries of the district. Hey, thanks for the clarification, Jeff. I'm glad that we got that taken care of. Okay. Oh, another one? Okay.
Yeah. Will we be getting a spreadsheet to calculate our Title IIA? Oh. And I feel we have heard nothing about Title IIA since this fall.
So as far as the spreadsheet goes, I will share that spreadsheet with Melinda Biesner, with our colleague Melinda, to see if that's something that would be of use, because it is mostly ready to go. We used it before we had the tab in our electronic application. I know, as Russ mentioned, that it has been, Title IV has run into difficulties around the technical side, getting it included in our online system. So I'll make sure to take that information back to Melinda and share with her that there is a desire for more communication around Title IV.
And Jeff is asking, what if it is not in boundaries in the district?
So I think you're asking, what if the private school is not within the boundaries of the district? If it were not within the boundaries of the district, then they should not be receiving an equitable share from your district. So Jeff, it sounds like perhaps maybe if you have an additional question about that, you can contact Russ and I separately, but certainly a private school should only be receiving an equitable share from you if they are within the boundaries of your district.
For 2A and 4A.
For 2A and 4A. Okay, thank you, Russ, for that clarification. Okay, the third reminder is about allowability. And just a reminder that private school activities, just as is the case with districts, private school activities need to be based on their needs assessment. Many districts offer private schools the option of participating in the district professional learning, and that is a wonderful opportunity for districts and private schools to build relationships. And there are often cases in which the private school needs will match learning that's being offered by the district. It's important to remember, however, that that is not the only option for private schools, and that they must be allowed to engage in activities that align to their needs, which may not align with what is being offered by the district. The second bullet I cannot emphasize enough, because every year we get a district sending us a question about reimbursing their private school. The school may not be reimbursed by the district. The district is the fiscal agent. Schools should not be purchasing plane tickets and registration to conferences and things expecting a reimbursement from the district, because the chances are that will not happen. So it's just really important that the communication between the private school and the district be one in which the district is acting as the fiscal agent and making those purchases for the private school. In terms of allowability, essentially anything that meets Title IIA requirements is allowable for private schools, just as it is for districts. There are some exceptions that we continue to share, including salaries and benefits. So private schools may not claim funds to pay for salaries, benefits, or substitutes within their school. They can attend conferences. Often private schools will attend conferences that may have a religious component, and that's fine as long as the Title IIA funds that are allocated to cover the cost of whatever portion of that conference is related to secular content. So if there are sessions at that conference that are related solely to secular material, then that can be, Title IIA funds can be used to pay for that portion of the conference. It looks like we have another question, maybe. Oh no, that's a private. That must be a private question. Okay, I see a couple of private questions. Okay, great. Sorry. Moving on. In terms of new guidance, so this is kind of the preview piece. Just want to share with you that as we move forward, I shared in our May webinar last year, our technical assistance webinar that we offer every May, and we will offer again this year. I shared with you the goal of the agency in moving towards ultimately a consolidated needs assessment, a way for districts to really look at all of their title resources and use those to help fund their overall priorities, and that we're trying to move away from these buckets of funds and into a more comprehensive look at how we fund our needs as a district. And we started that process with that federal funds guide that came out as part of the Teaching, Learning, and Assessment Institute this summer, and work continues at the agency toward developing that. In the interim, to my knowledge, the online application will not change, but we are trying to bring the line items for Title IIA into kind of a parallel format. So districts should expect that when they're filling out the line items for each of their private schools, that they're using the same structure to describe what the private school is doing. And so I'm sharing this with you now so that you can share it in consultation. And those primary things are, we want to know the what, the who, and the how. What are the knowledge and skills that those private school teachers and principals will be obtaining? Who is participating? And the how is actually going to start shifting. We're going to ask both districts and private schools to describe how you will measure effectiveness. How are you going to know whether the strategies or activities had the impact? What's your plan to measure whether it worked? So those same guidelines that districts are asked to follow, we'll ask private schools to follow. So that's information for you. You consult with your private school so that they're aware of the kind of information that you need from them in order to communicate to ODE through the application how they're spending their funds. The second bullet here about conferences, those of you who are district Title IIA folks should be aware by now. We've sent several communications about this, that we've been asking for conferences and workshops that there be a description of how that 1 or 2 day event is part of a longer, more comprehensive plan, and how the content is being scaled up within the district. And the reason that we're making that concerted effort is because ESSA really emphasized the fact that the definition of professional learning really does exclude conferences and workshops. 1 day standalone events do not meet that definition. And we understand that conferences and workshops can have great benefit as long as they are one piece of a larger plan. So I included this bullet here to let you know that that's an expectation that private schools should be aware of moving forward. Conference attendance is still an allowable activity, but we need to understand how it fits in the larger context of your plan for ongoing professional learning. We are going to make sure that this new information is included in our guidance documents when we do our May technical assistance webinar. I always update our guidance documents prior to that webinar so that you have sort of the latest and greatest, and we will do that prior to May. But I have put together a 2-page document with Russ. Russ and I put that together that covers essentially what we talked about here today. And I'm going to send that out on the Title IIA listserv, and we'll post it maybe under the PowerPoint for you to have for the purposes of consultation this spring. We know that you'll be having those meetings sooner rather than later, so I want to make sure that you have it. And it's just a 1-pager, 2-sided document that summarizes what we've discussed in the webinar today. Okay. That concludes the information that we wanted to share with you. Shelley, can you confirm? I don't think I see any other questions listed on the chat, but if anyone has additional, oh, here's one. Do Title I and Title II have the same allowabilities and restrictions?
I don't know that that's an easy answer. I guess I would need more information about what you mean by the same allowability restrictions. As far as I can say in general that we hold to the same regulations that Sarah mentioned earlier about reimbursements directly to private schools. You cannot, If you make any purchases on behalf of the private school in the way of materials or equipment, it belongs to the district. You can't pay substitute stipends and things of that nature, just like in 2A. But beyond that, I'm not sure, without further information about what you mean by the similar allowability, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Well, and I think so my interpretation of that is the primary difference in my understanding of Title I and Title II. Title IIA funds cannot be used to purchase anything that would be for use with students. So Title IIA is about improving the practice of educators, teachers, principals, paraprofessionals in some cases. And so it is really about the use of funds to improve practice, whereas Title IIA can be, or Title IA, excuse me, can be used to purchase materials and things that are directly for use in classrooms with students. So that would be the biggest difference that I would say in terms of 1A and 2A.
Yeah, and I would add one more thing around, the same kinds of things that can happen in a targeted assistance school, targeted assisted Title I school, where you have professional development needs for your Title I teachers and paras. It's the same thing that we allow in a private school with regard to professional development. Any teacher who has contact with a student who's receiving Title I services can receive some professional development through Title I, whether they're actually paid by Title I or not. So in that regard, that would be one clarification I would make around professional development. But it applies the same way as Title IIA, where it has to be secular and non-ideological. So it cannot be for you wouldn't be able to use materials, for example, with a student or give professional development around those materials to teachers if the materials are religious in nature. So that's one clarification I would make. Other than that, they are, as Sarah mentioned, really Title I is student-directed and Title IIA is really the professional development for teachers and staff.
I see another question that coming through. Do we know the status of Title IIA next year, and if we will receive a reduction statewide? Very timely question. As a matter of fact, my director is in Washington, D.C. right now, attending a conference, a Title I conference, and one of the questions on his list is to ask this very question: what is the status of Title IIA? So please know that we have that on our radar, and we are trying to get an answer as soon as possible. A budget has not been passed, so until that happens, I can't theorize. In terms of reductions, I hope it was clearly communicated through the multiple avenues we used this year that the really dramatic reductions that some districts saw and others saw increases. Those really dramatic reductions were the result of the new formula that was put into place that took away that hold harmless that had kept so many districts at a floor. So that being said, I think that the allocations that were received this year, we should not see a dramatic change in what that looks like for next year, unless there is a substantial decrease to the allocation that the state, or increase, one can always hope.
Yes.
If there's a substantial change to the amount of funds that the state receives, obviously that will impact everyone. But in terms of the kind of precipitous drop that some districts got, that was a kind of a resetting year, and I don't anticipate that being the case moving forward. Let's see what else we have. Can salaries be paid for with Title I for private schools?
The only salary that can be paid for Title I is the person providing the services, and that employee needs to be an employee of the district, or a third-party contractor can also be paid out of that. But no, you cannot pay salaries or benefits for a private school teacher out of Title I.
Thank you, Russ. Another question says, I'm still confused about private schools outside of our school district. What is the process for these schools? So any private school is going to seek, or let me rephrase that. Districts are going to reach out to the private schools within their boundaries and invite them to participate in title programs. So your responsibility as a district is to identify the private schools within your boundaries and invite them into that process. Any schools that are not within your boundary are not anything you need to be concerning yourself with. Is that correct?
Except in Title I.
Okay, there you go.
Title I is the kind of the unique piece to this, in that if you have students that reside in your district boundaries but attend a private school outside of your district, then you could be requested to consult with that private school to provide equitable services. We have a number of these in Southern Oregon, in Eugene, Salem, Portland, the metro area, where we have private schools that sit in, I'm going to just use an example, St. Therese Catholic School sits in the Park Grove School District, but a number of school districts in that area consult with that school for Title I services. It is kind of complicated, and again, there is a document on the private school website that sort of explains how that process works for each of the titles, the big titles, Title I, Title II, Title III, and I think we're adding Title IV to that. But it kind of explains the process for what the requirements are around consultation and serving students outside of your district. Title II is, and IV, for sure, though, you are only concerned with the students that are in your district and the private school students within your district. You don't have to reach across to other, and if your students are attending in a neighboring private school, neighboring district's private school, you don't have to worry about them under Title II and Title IV. But you do need to worry about your students who might be attending a private school outside of your district for Title I purposes.
Thank you. And there were several people who put things in the chat that answered that very question, saying, I think they're talking about Title IA school, or Title IA. Okay, we do have an additional question about indirect and administrative costs. For the deduction mentioned earlier, is it indirect plus admin costs for indirect and admin not to, okay, let me read it again. Is it indirect plus admin costs for indirect and admin not to exceed indirect rate? Yeah, and I'm sorry for any confusion. As I mentioned earlier, we are trying as specialists across this agency to ensure that the practices that we're engaging in when it comes to these applications are as uniform as possible where appropriate. So let me start by saying that. So that is to say that in communication with our Title IA colleagues, the practice has been that the amount that is withheld or deducted from the district's overall allocation should not exceed the district's indirect rate. So if you have administrative costs for Title IIA, you can deduct those as long as the deduction does not exceed the total that would be the indirect rate for the district. That is what I'm saying. So if you have a 4.5% indirect rate and your admin costs exceed that, you would deduct as much as the 4.5% would allow, and that's how much could be taken off the top of the district's costs before engaging in, or before calculating the equitable share. Presumably some of the costs of that individual are to administer the costs within the district, not just with the private school.
Where it does get a little confusing is in the Title I world. Could I take a moment to explain this? Is that you are required, or districts are required to take the private school equitable share off the top of their Title I allocation before any of that any of those other reservations are made, including indirect. So what happens is that amount is set aside, and you put that aside over there. You can still charge indirect on the total amount, but it can't come out of the private, the private school amount cannot be reduced for indirect costs. Now, having said that, if there are administrative costs to operate the private school program at the district level, you can take that out of the private school set aside, but it cannot exceed the total amount that you would qualify for indirect. So if you have 4.5%, you can take that 4.5% indirect off your entire allocation. It just has to be on top of whatever you set aside for the private school. I know this gets a little...
Yeah, this is telling me that we need to clarify our language, and I appreciate the questions, because that helps us know where we are missing the mark. So we need to clarify our language around indirect to make sure that we are communicating it clearly. So, and again, you know, many districts have already submitted their application this year, have done so in good faith, have calculated it based on the guidance they understood they received from us. So what we're communicating in here should in no way be construed as saying you have to go back and change something. We just want to make sure we clarify as we move forward so that everybody has a better picture, because everyone's goal is to make sure that private schools receive their equitable share. Okay, next question. When will we see preliminary allocations for Title II and IV for 18-19? That never happens before the summer.
Yeah.
And so I know districts, that is not timely for districts who are planning in the spring. And I wish that we had more control over that, but we don't. It typically happens in July or early August, depending on when we receive the information from USED. So I apologize that we can't get that to you sooner. The next question says, how do services work across states? Would an Idaho school-wide school be responsible for providing services to their students attending a private school in Oregon? Wow. So this is from Annabelle, who's over in Ontario.
Okay, and is
this for Title? I wonder if she's asking about, you mean for Title I or Title II?
Yeah, that would be nice.
I don't know if it's, she did not specify, so maybe she can add that and we can come back to her question. Do we need to reach out to private schools outside of our district for Title IA, or are they expected to contact us? How would we know which private schools serve our resident students? Great question.
Okay. I feel bad that we've
veered into Title I territory. Don't feel bad.
Commandeered the Title II private
All
school.
right.
It's a good question. I've always asked school districts to do a good faith effort in reaching out. If you know that this is something that happens from year to year, it's really a good opportunity to kind of build that relationship, even if they're not within your district. Oftentimes, though, I do in the training we've done is that it really the onus on reaching out to the home district of a student they have in their private school rests with the private school itself. So if you've got districts or your students are attending a private school that sits in another district, for Title I purposes, they really should be reaching out to you. Now, that said, I've had a number of questions around what's the timeline on that. It really needs to be something that should, if possible, happen in the spring during the regular consultation period where the private school does that reaching out if they anticipate students. But sometimes they don't know if that's going to be, who they're going to actually have until later in the summer. And so I do recommend a little flexibility on the part of the school district where that's concerned, but certainly not dragging it out. So within a couple of weeks of school beginning, if there's the possibility of readjusting things to serve those kids, that would be great.
Thank you, Russ. The next one says it would be great to have a webinar around Title I and private schools with some examples of what other districts are doing.
Okay, we did have one, I believe, earlier this year, but we can certainly schedule another one. So we'll try to make that available in maybe sometime. I'm thinking March or would be the best that I can do at this point.
Okay. Another Title IA question. Sorry, Russ. Related to Title IA, is the per student costs, admin costs indirect, based on the district in which the private school is or the district in which the student resides? Okay, I really don't have an answer to that right now. I would prefer that person, whoever asked that question, would you
send that to me in an email. I'd like to study that a little more before I provide a response.
Okay. And then the question that we had earlier from Annabelle about crossing states, services across states, that was in relation to Title IIA. So her question was, would an Idaho school-wide school be responsible for providing services to their students attending a private school in Oregon? So if they're pulling students from Idaho into a private school in Oregon, is the other state responsible?
It would be the neighboring school district. Yes, it'd be the same, even though it's across state lines. It would be the same. That you would, if the private school sits in Ontario, for example, and the student resides. Excuse me. The private school sits in Ontario, and the student is from Idaho. Let me think about this real quick.
Is this another one you want sent via email?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's a little.
It's fine. No, I think that's okay. Looks like that is the last question on the list. So we'll pause just for a moment to see if anyone has any additional questions that they did not get answered. While we're waiting for that, I'll tell you that we will, as I mentioned, hold the May Technical Assistance webinar. I have not set a date for that yet, but I'll send that out on the Title IIA listserv. I'll save the date once I have it. We will post this PowerPoint and the two-page interim guidance, if you want to call it that, the sort of cheat sheet for you to use in your consultations. If you will find it helpful, we'll post those on the Title IIA webpage. And then at some point, this webinar will be posted once we have the closed captioning added.
And if there's a need to have it before the closed caption, then I can send the link out, knowing, to individuals, knowing that.
Okay, if you have an individual need. Okay, that sounds good. I don't see any other questions coming through, so we will thank you for your time today and look forward to the next time we speak with you. Thanks again.